Millionaire loses 5-year-old son in an accident. 20 years later, he freezes upon seeing a gardener identical to him in the garden of his mansion. He approached. Scott Bennett stared out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his sprawling Beverly Hills mansion. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the immaculately trimmed hedges and perfectly manicured lawns below. The beauty of the scene, however, barely registered. For Scott, it was just another day spent navigating the emptiness that had consumed his life for the past 20 years. The loss of Joshua, his 5-year-old son, had carved a gaping hole in his heart. The car accident that claimed the boy's life, or so he had believed, was a memory etched in pain. Despite his immense wealth and influence, Scott had been powerless to prevent the tragedy, and no amount of money could undo what had been done. The weight of regret bore down on him, relentless and unforgiving. Scott's staff was well aware of his quiet moods. He rarely spoke to anyone unless it was strictly necessary, preferring instead to bury himself in work. His days were filled with endless meetings, deal negotiations, and discussions about his vast business empire. Yet, no amount of distraction could silence the nagging ache in his chest. That morning, as he sipped his coffee and absent-mindedly scanned through emails, a movement outside caught his eye. A young man, dressed in a simple green shirt and jeans, was working in the garden. Scott squinted, leaning closer to the window. Curious, the new gardener, he thought. He hadn't been informed of a change in staff, but it wasn't unusual. Such details were typically handled by his assistant. The man's presence wasn't what caught Scott's attention, though. It was something else. Something about the way he moved, the way he tilted his head as he studied a stubborn patch of weeds. For a fleeting moment, Scott felt a jolt in his chest. The young man's gestures, the way his hair caught the light, even his posture. There was something hauntingly familiar. Shaking his head, Scott brushed the thought aside. "You're imagining things," he told himself, but the nagging feeling wouldn't let go. He found himself watching the man for several minutes, studying every detail. Later that day, Scott asked his assistant about the new hire. "Noah," she said. "He started last week. Seems hard-working. Quiet. Keeps to himself." "Noah," Scott repeated under his breath. The name didn't mean anything to him, but he couldn't shake the sense that he needed to know more. That afternoon, Scott ventured out to the garden under the pretense of stretching his legs. Noah was kneeling by a flower bed, pulling weeds with practiced efficiency. "Good afternoon," Scott said, his voice calm but curious. Noah looked up, startled, and quickly got to his feet. "Good afternoon, sir," he replied. His tone was polite, respectful, but reserved. Scott took a moment to study him up close. The resemblance was uncanny. Those eyes, that jawline, every detail seemed to echo memories of Joshua. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but he forced himself to keep his composure. "You're new here," Scott said, offering a faint smile. "Yes, sir. I started last week. I'm grateful for the opportunity." Scott nodded, folding his arms. "Where are you from, Noah?" "Los Angeles," Noah replied. "But I grew up in an orphanage near San Diego. I moved back here a few years ago." The mention of the orphanage made Scott's breath catch. An orphanage. His mind raced. He wanted to ask more, to press for details, but he knew he couldn't rush this. Instead, he kept the conversation light, asking about Noah's work and how he was settling in that evening. Scott couldn't focus on anything else. He dug through old photo albums, pulling out pictures of Joshua. His son's cherubic face stared back at him from the glossy pages, each image a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost. He compared them to his mental image of Noah, and the similarities only deepened his unease. By the time the sun set, Scott had made up his mind. He needed answers. The next morning, he contacted a private investigator he had worked with in the past. The man, known for his discretion and thoroughness, listened carefully as Scott explained the situation. "I need to know everything about this young man, where he's from, what happened to him, and if there's any connection to my son," the investigator agreed. But he warned Scott not to get his hopes up. "You've been through a lot, Mr. Bennett," he said gently. "Sometimes when we want something badly enough, our minds can play tricks on us." Scott understood the caution, but his instincts told him otherwise. Deep down, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. As he stood by the window that evening, looking out at the dimly lit garden, Scott watched Noah gather his tools and head toward the small shed at the edge of the property. For the first time in decades, Scott felt like the emptiness inside him might finally have a chance to be filled. Could it really be him? The question lingered in his mind as the night stretched on. Scott woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The idea that Noah might be Joshua had taken root in his mind. Refusing to be dismissed as a delusion, he was determined to unravel the mystery, no matter what it took. As he sat at the breakfast table, sipping his coffee and skimming through the morning news on his tablet, his thoughts drifted back to the brief conversation with Noah, the young man's demeanor, his politeness, and that fleeting moment of hesitation when Scott had asked about his past. All of it seemed to hint at something deeper, but was he seeing only what he wanted to see? Scott's focus was interrupted when his assistant, Marla, entered the room carrying a folder. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she greeted him with her usual efficiency. "I've prepared the reports you requested for the upcoming board meeting." He nodded absent-mindedly, taking the folder but placing it aside. "Marla," he began, his tone more personal than professional. "What do you think of the new gardener?" She paused, slightly taken aback by the question. "Noah, he's polite, hard-working, keeps his head down. Why do you ask?" Scott shrugged, masking his curiosity with nonchalance. "Just curious, he seems different." Marla raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "Would you like me to gather any specific information about him?" Scott hesitated. He had already engaged a private investigator, but he didn't want to seem overly suspicious. "No need for now," he replied. "Just keep an eye on him." Later that day, Scott decided to observe Noah more closely. From his office window, he watched as the young man worked in the garden, trimming hedges and planting seasonal flowers. There was a grace to his movements, a quiet confidence that Scott couldn't ignore. He was tempted to approach him again but decided against it. Instead, he waited until Noah finished his work and headed to the small shed where the gardening tools were stored. Scott strolled outside, feigning casual interest. The late morning sun bathed the garden in a golden glow, and the scent of freshly turned soil filled the air. As he approached the shed, he found Noah organizing tools on a rack. "Noah," Scott called, his voice warm but inquisitive. The young man turned, a hint of surprise in his expression. "Mr. Bennett," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Is there something I can help you with?" Scott gestured toward the garden. "You've done a great job out there. The place hasn't looked this good in years." Noah smiled, a shy but genuine expression that reminded Scott painfully of Joshua. "Thank you." "Sir, I'm just doing my job." Scott leaned against the doorframe of the shed. "Tell me, Noah, what got you into this line of work?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground. "I guess I've always liked working with my hands," he said finally. "Being outdoors, taking care of plants. It's calming. I didn't really have much of a choice growing up, so I just found my way here." "Not much of a choice," Scott pressed gently. "What do you mean?" Noah sighed, his shoulders tensing slightly. "I grew up in an orphanage," he admitted. "They didn't exactly prepare us for big career opportunities. You take what you can get." Scott's chest tightened. The pieces were beginning to align, but he needed more. "Do you remember anything about your life before the orphanage?" he asked cautiously. "Your parents, perhaps?" Noah shook his head. "Not really. I was told I was found near a highway, but I don't remember much else." It's all kind of blurry. The revelation hit Scott like a wave. Near a highway. The same detail from the fateful night when Joshua had disappeared. He fought to maintain his composure, nodding thoughtfully. "That must have been difficult," he said, growing up without answers. Noah shrugged, trying to downplay the significance. "You get used to it." Scott's instincts screamed at him to say more, to tell Noah about Joshua, about the accident, about his suspicions, but he knew it was too soon. If he pushed too hard, he risked alienating the young man. Instead, he offered a small smile. "Well, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you." "Sir," Noah replied, his tone sincere but guarded, as Scott walked back to the house. His mind raced. The similarities between Noah and Joshua were too many to ignore. His heart told him this was his son, but he needed concrete proof. That afternoon, he called the private investigator for an update. "I've looked into Noah's records," the investigator reported. "There's not much to go on. He was found as a child near a stretch of highway outside San Diego. No ID, no family came forward. The orphanage didn't keep detailed records from that time." Scott's pulse quickened. "Do you think there's a chance he's connected to my son?" "There's always a chance," the investigator replied cautiously. "But we'll need more to go on. A DNA test would be definitive, but getting a sample without raising suspicion might be tricky." Scott agreed, his resolve hardening. He would find a way to get the answers he needed. That evening, as he sat alone in his study, Scott stared at an old photograph of Joshua. The boy's bright eyes and mischievous smile seemed to leap off the page, pulling him into memories of a life that had been stolen from them both. He placed the photo beside him and began drafting a plan to confirm Noah's identity. "If this really is Joshua, I need to know. I've waited 20 years. I can't wait any longer." The following morning, Scott Bennett woke up restless. His mind was a tangle of memories and unanswered questions. The faint hope that Noah might be Joshua gave him a purpose he hadn't felt in decades, but it also reopened old wounds he'd worked so hard to suppress. He made his way to his office, where sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the room. On his desk was the photograph he'd retrieved the night before, a picture of himself, his late wife, and a 5-year-old Joshua on a family vacation. They were all smiles, frozen in a moment of happiness that now felt like a lifetime ago. Scott picked up the picture, running his fingers over the frame. His heart ached as he remembered the day it was taken. Joshua had been ecstatic about visiting the beach, and his laughter had echoed in Scott's ears all afternoon. It was one of the last happy memories before the accident that shattered everything. The sound of a knock at the door pulled Scott out of his reverie. "Come in," he said, setting the photo down. Marla stepped inside, carrying a tray with coffee and a folder tucked under her arm. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she greeted, placing the coffee on his desk. "You have a meeting scheduled in an hour, but I can push it back if you need more time." Scott shook his head. "No, I'll be ready." He gestured to the folder. "What's that?" Marla handed it to him. "It's the updated landscaping proposal for the garden. Noah submitted it this morning." Scott's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "He's submitting proposals now." She smiled faintly. "Apparently he's quite detail-oriented. He made a few suggestions to enhance the garden's layout. Small changes, but thoughtful ones." Scott opened the folder, scanning the neat handwriting and diagrams. It was clear that Noah had put a lot of effort into his work. Each suggestion was meticulously explained. With a focus on improving the garden's aesthetics while maintaining practicality, it reminded Scott of Joshua's old-school projects, always done with care and precision. "Interesting," Scott murmured. "I'll look into this later. Thank you, Marla." As she left the room, Scott leaned back in his chair, his thoughts returning to Noah. The young man's work ethic and attention to detail only deepened Scott's belief that he might be his son, but belief wasn't enough. He needed proof. Later that afternoon, Scott decided to approach Noah again. He found him working near the rose bushes, carefully pruning the vibrant blooms. Noah didn't notice Scott's presence at first, so absorbed in his task that he seemed to lose track of the world around him. "Noah," Scott called softly, not wanting to startle him. The young man turned, smiling politely. "Mr. Bennett, how can I help you?" Scott gestured to the garden. "The roses look incredible. You've done an excellent job." "Thank you, sir. I'm glad you're happy with it." Scott hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Do you have a minute? There's something I'd like to talk to you about." Noah straightened, setting his pruning shears aside. "Of course." Scott led him to a shaded bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. The air was warm, filled with the scent of flowers and freshly cut grass. They sat in silence for a moment before Scott spoke. "You've mentioned before that you don't remember much about your childhood," Scott began, choosing his words carefully. "Has that ever bothered you?" Noah frowned slightly, his gaze drifting to the garden. "I guess it used to," he admitted. "When I was a kid, I'd wonder about my parents, who they were, why they didn't come for me. But as I got older, I stopped thinking about it. It didn't change anything." Scott nodded slowly. "Do you ever feel like something's missing? Like there's a part of you you'll never get back?" Noah hesitated, as if unsure how to answer. Sometimes, he said finally, but I've learned to live with it. I guess I've always thought that if my past really mattered, it would find a way to catch up with me. Scott's chest tightened at the words. Your past is right here, he thought. But he didn't say it aloud. Instead, he asked, have you ever considered looking into your past? Trying to find out where you came from? Noah shook his head. Not really. I wouldn't even know where to start. What if someone helped you? Scott pressed gently. Would you want to know the truth? Noah looked at him curiously, his brow furrowing. Why are you asking me this, Mr. Bennett? Scott's pulse quickened. He realized he was treading dangerous ground, and if he wasn't careful, he could scare Noah away. Just curiosity, he said with a faint smile. I've always believed that understanding where we come from can help us figure out where we're going. Noah didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a faint longing he didn't know how to express. I'll think about it, he said at last. Scott nodded, standing up to leave. That's all I wanted to ask. Keep up the good work, Noah. The gardens never looked better. As Scott walked back to the house, his mind was racing. Every conversation with Noah seemed to confirm his suspicions, but it wasn't enough. He needed tangible evidence, a way to bridge the gap between the past and the present. That evening, he received a call from the private investigator. Mr. Bennett, the man said, his tone serious. I've tracked down some records from the orphanage where Noah grew up. There's a detail I think you'll want to hear. Scott gripped the phone tightly, his heart pounding. Go on. The records mention that Noah was found near a highway after a car accident. There's no other information, but the timeline matches. Scott's breath caught. It was the confirmation he'd been waiting for. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Keep digging. I need to know everything. As he hung up, Scott sat in his study, staring at the photo of Joshua once more. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. One thing was certain. He was closer to the truth than ever before. Scott spent the following day in an unshakable state of anticipation. The private investigator's revelation had confirmed what his heart had already begun to suspect. Noah's past was intertwined with the tragedy that had defined his life, but there were still so many questions, and Scott knew he couldn't jump to conclusions without solid proof. To calm his restless mind, he decided to immerse himself in his usual routine. Business meetings, phone calls, and reports provided some distraction, but even as he reviewed financial projections and signed off on contracts, his thoughts continually drifted back to Noah. What if he was wrong? What if his desperation for closure had made him see things that weren't there? As the afternoon sun warmed the sprawling estate, Scott ventured outside for a walk. The garden had always been a refuge of sorts, a place where he could think clearly amidst the carefully cultivated beauty. Today, however, it felt different. Every corner seemed to carry a shadow of uncertainty. He found Noah trimming the hedges along the back pathway. The young man looked up as Scott approached, offering a polite smile. Afternoon, Mr. Bennett. Noah, Scott began, his tone casual. Do you have a moment? I'd like to talk to you about something. Of course, Noah said, setting down his tools and dusting off his hands. What's on your mind? Scott gestured toward a stone bench under a nearby tree. They walked over and sat down, the shade providing a reprieve from the bright sunlight. For a moment, Scott said nothing, unsure of how to broach the subject without raising suspicion. Finally, he decided on a more indirect approach. You've been doing a fantastic job here, he said. The garden hasn't looked this good in years. I appreciate the care you've put into it. Thank you, sir, Noah replied, his tone modest. It's nice to work in a place like this. I've had jobs where no one really cared about the details. Scott smiled faintly. Details matter. It's the little things that make all the difference, don't you think? Noah nodded, though he seemed unsure where the conversation was going. I suppose so. Scott hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. Speaking of details, I've been thinking about what you mentioned the other day, about your childhood. Noah's expression grew guarded, and Scott quickly added, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you ever tried to learn more about what happened to you before you were found? I know it might not be easy, but sometimes understanding the past can bring a sense of closure. Noah looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. I haven't, he admitted. I guess I never thought it would change anything. What's the point in digging up something that's been buried for so long? Scott's heart ached at the response, but he kept his emotions in check. Sometimes the things we bury have a way of resurfacing, whether we're ready for them or not, he said gently. And when they do, it can be better to face them head on. Noah didn't reply immediately, but Scott could see the wheels turning in his mind after a moment. He shrugged. Maybe. I don't really know where I'd start. Scott decided not to push further. Instead, he gave Noah a reassuring nod. Well, if you ever change your mind, I'd be happy to help. You're not alone in this, Noah. The young man glanced at Scott, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Thanks, he said quietly. I appreciate that. As they parted ways, Scott felt a mix of hope and frustration. Noah's reluctance was understandable, but it also meant that Scott would have to tread carefully. If he pushed too hard, he risked alienating the young man and losing any chance of confirming his suspicions. That evening, Scott received another call from the private investigator. I've looked into the records from the orphanage, the man said. There's not much to go on, but I did find a detail you might find interesting. Scott's grip on the phone tightened. What is it? The orphanage's records mention that Noah was found with a small pendant. It was described as a silver locket with no markings. Does that mean anything to you? Scott's breath caught. He remembered the locket vividly. It had been a gift to Joshua from his mother, a small keepsake engraved with a simple heart. Scott had assumed it was lost in the accident, but if Noah had been found with it... It means everything, Scott said, his voice unsteady. Do you have any idea where the locket is now? I'm still looking into that, the investigator replied. The records aren't clear on whether it was kept or discarded, but if it's still around, I'll find it. Scott thanked him and ended the call, his mind racing. The locket was the missing piece, the tangible link between Noah and Joshua. If he could find it, there would be no denying the truth. As the days passed, Scott kept a close eye on Noah, observing him during his work, and engaging him in small conversations whenever the opportunity arose. He noticed the way Noah interacted with the staff, kind but reserved, and the quiet determination he brought to every task. The more Scott saw, the more convinced he became that this young man was his son. But with each passing moment, the stakes felt higher. Scott knew that uncovering the truth wouldn't just bring closure. It would also reopen wounds and force him to confront the darkest chapter of his life. And if Noah truly was Joshua, what would that mean for their future? As Scott stood at his office window one evening, watching the last rays of sunlight fade over the garden, he made a silent vow, no matter what it took. No matter, he would uncover the truth. And when he did, he would do everything in his power to make up for the years they had lost. Scott Bennett sat in his study, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp. The silence was broken only by the soft rustle of paper as he flipped through the private investigator's latest report. His heart raced with every word he read. The detail about the locket haunted him. It was a concrete connection to Joshua, one that could finally confirm his suspicions about Noah. The investigator's notes indicated that the orphanage records had been sparse, a result of poor record-keeping practices from 2 decades ago. However, the mention of the silver locket stood out. Scott could still picture the pendant in his mind, a delicate heart-shaped charm with an engraving so faint it was barely visible. It was the kind of detail only a parent would remember. Determined to learn more, Scott picked up the phone and called the investigator. Have you found anything else about the locket? He asked without preamble. Not yet, the investigator admitted. The records don't specify what happened to it after Noah arrived at the orphanage, but I've reached out to a few former staff members who might remember. I should have more information in a few days. Scott sighed, trying to temper his impatience. I need this resolved as soon as possible. I understand, Mr. Bennett. I'll keep digging. Scott hung up, his mind racing. The locket was the missing piece, and until he found it, everything else felt like speculation. He glanced at the framed photo of Joshua on his desk, the boy's bright eyes seeming to encourage him to keep pushing forward. The next morning, Scott found himself outside earlier than usual. The air was crisp, and the garden was bathed in soft morning light. He spotted Noah near the rose bushes, carefully arranging a fresh planting of flowers. The sight of him brought an ache to Scott's chest. Each passing day made the resemblance more undeniable. Noah, Scott called, walking over to him. Noah looked up, wiping dirt from his hands. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." Scott offered a small smile. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" "Not at all," Noah replied, stepping back to make room. Scott crouched down beside him, pretending to examine the freshly planted roses. "You've got a talent for this," he said. "The garden looks better than ever." "Thank you," Noah said, his tone modest. "I enjoy it. It's good to see the results of your work." Scott studied the young man's profile, the familiarity of his features stirring a painful mix of hope and doubt. "Noah," he began cautiously, "I was wondering, have you ever found anything from your childhood? Something that might give you a clue about your past?" Noah's brow furrowed in thought. "Not really," he said after a moment. "I didn't have much when I was at the orphanage, just the clothes I was found in." Scott's pulse quickened. "What about personal items? A toy, a piece of jewelry?" Noah shook his head. "No, nothing like that. If there was anything, I never saw it." Scott nodded, hiding his disappointment. "I see, I just thought. Sometimes small things can carry big stories." Noah seemed puzzled by the comment, but didn't press further. "Maybe," he said with a shrug, "but I've never thought much about it. The past is the past." Scott forced a smile. "You're right. I didn't mean to pry." As Scott stood to leave, Noah glanced up at him. "Mr. Bennett," he said hesitantly, "why do you care so much about my past?" Scott froze, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, he considered telling Noah everything, but he quickly dismissed the thought. It was too soon. Instead, he offered a vague response. "I've always believed that understanding where we come from can help us figure out where we're going. That's all." Noah nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, if I ever find anything, I'll let you know." Scott gave him a tight smile and walked back toward the house, his mind racing. He was treading a delicate line. Too much pressure and he could push Noah away, but every conversation left him more convinced that Noah was Joshua, and the need for answers was becoming unbearable. That evening, Scott received an unexpected call from the investigator. "Mr. Bennett," the man said, his voice holding a note of excitement. "I think I've found something." Scott sat up in his chair, gripping the phone tightly. "What is it?" "One of the former orphanage staff members I spoke to remembers the locket," the investigator explained. "She said it was kept in a storage box along with a few other personal items from children who arrived without families." "Do you know where it is now?" Scott asked urgently. "Yes," the investigator replied. "The box was sent to a local charity when the orphanage shut down. The charity still has it in their archives. I've arranged to pick it up tomorrow." Scott's heart leapt. "That's incredible news. Let me know as soon as you have it." "I will," the investigator promised. After hanging up, Scott leaned back in his chair, his emotions a whirlwind. If the locket turned out to be Joshua's, it would confirm everything. But it also meant confronting the full weight of what had happened that night. The loss, the years of searching, and the possibility that Joshua had been alive all this time without Scott knowing. The next day felt like an eternity. Scott kept himself busy with work, but his thoughts were consumed by the upcoming revelation. By the time the investigator called in the late afternoon, Scott was practically pacing his office. "I've got the locket," the investigator said, "and it matches your description perfectly." Scott's breath caught. "Can you bring it to me?" "I'm on my way now." As Scott waited, his hands trembled with anticipation. The locket was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of the hope he'd clung to for 2 decades. And now, it was finally within reach. Scott Bennett sat in his study, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared at the clock. Each tick of the second hand seemed louder than usual, echoing in the quiet room and amplifying his anticipation. The private investigator was on his way, and with him, the locket, a relic from a past Scott thought he had lost forever. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Scott sprang to his feet, his pulse quickening. He opened the door to find the investigator standing there, holding a small, weathered box in his hands. "Mr. Bennett," the man greeted, "I believe this is what you've been looking for." Scott gestured for him to come in, his eyes fixed on the box as though it contained all the answers to his questions. They moved to the desk, and the investigator carefully set the box down, opening it to reveal a delicate silver locket nestled among a few other small items. Scott reached for it with trembling hands, The moment his fingers brushed the cool metal, a wave of emotion surged through him. He recognized it immediately. The locket was exactly as he remembered. A heart-shaped charm with a faint engraving of a flower, almost imperceptible after years of wear. "It's his," Scott said, his voice thick with emotion. "There's no doubt about it." The investigator nodded. "I thought you'd say that." The staff member who remembered it described it in detail. It was the only item found with Noah when he arrived at the orphanage. Scott swallowed hard, his mind racing. The connection was undeniable, but it still wasn't absolute proof. "We need to do a DNA test," he said firmly. "I can't rely on circumstantial evidence alone." The investigator nodded. "I assumed as much. I've already arranged for a lab to process the test. All I need is a sample from you and Noah." Scott exhaled deeply. "Getting my sample isn't a problem, Noah. That's going to take some finesse." The investigator's expression was thoughtful. "Perhaps you could frame it as part of a routine health check or something work-related. It might make it easier to obtain his cooperation without raising suspicion." Scott nodded slowly. Considering the suggestion, he would have to tread carefully. Noah was already curious about Scott's interest in his past, and pushing too hard could make him pull away. Later that day, Scott found Noah in the greenhouse, tending to a row of orchids. The vibrant flowers filled the space with bursts of color, their delicate petals a testament to Noah's meticulous care. Scott paused in the doorway, watching the young man work. He reminded Scott so much of Joshua, not just in appearance, but in his quiet focus and gentle demeanor. "Noah," Scott called softly, stepping into the greenhouse. Noah looked up, a faint smile on his face. "Mr. Bennett, what brings you out here?" "I wanted to check on the greenhouse," Scott said casually, though his real purpose was far more significant. "You've done an incredible job. It looks better than ever." "Thanks," Noah said, his tone modest. "I'm glad you think so." Scott hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I was also wondering if you'd be willing to help me with something. It's related to the estate." "Of course," Noah said, setting down his tools. "What do you need?" Scott chose his words carefully. "I've been thinking about offering health benefits for the staff, routine checkups, things like that. But before I roll it out, I want to make sure it's something everyone would find useful. Would you be willing to help me test the process? It would involve a simple medical screening." Noah seemed surprised by the request, but he nodded. "Sure, that sounds like a good idea." Scott smiled, relieved. "Great. I'll have Marla arrange everything. It won't take long." As Scott left the greenhouse, he felt a mix of guilt and resolve. He hated deceiving Noah, but the stakes were too high to let this opportunity slip away. The DNA test would provide the definitive answer he needed, and once he had it, there would be no turning back. The following day, Noah and Scott both provided samples for the screening. Scott kept his emotions in check as the lab technician collected the necessary materials, but inside, he was a whirlwind of anxiety. The results would take a few days and the waiting felt unbearable. In the meantime, Scott tried to distract himself with work, but his thoughts kept circling back to the locket and what it represented. He spent hours going through old photo albums, revisiting memories of Joshua's childhood. Each picture brought a mixture of joy and sorrow, a reminder of what had been lost and what might still be found. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the investigator called with the results. Scott's hands shook as he picked up the phone. "Mr. Bennett," the investigator said, his tone steady but tinged with emotion. "The results are in." Scott's breath caught. "And there's no question," the investigator replied. "Noah is Joshua. He's your son." For a moment, Scott couldn't speak. Relief, joy, and disbelief washed over him in waves. He sank into his chair, his mind racing. After 20 years of searching, the truth was finally within his grasp. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "I don't even know what to say." "There's nothing else to say," the investigator replied. "Now it's up to you to decide how to tell him." As Scott hung up the phone, he felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. He had found Joshua. His son was alive. But how would he tell Noah? And how would the young man react to the truth? Scott knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let another day pass without addressing it. The time had come to confront the past and begin the process of rebuilding what had been lost. Scott Bennett stood in front of the mirror in his study, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. The reflection staring back at him was that of a man torn between relief and apprehension. After 20 years of searching, he had finally found his son, but the weight of the truth made his chest feel heavy. How would Noah react? Would he accept the life-altering revelation, or would it drive him further away? Scott took a deep breath and stepped out of the study, heading toward the garden where Noah was working. The late afternoon sun bathed the estate in a golden glow, the warmth of the light contrasting with the cold knot of anxiety in Scott's stomach. As he approached, he saw Noah trimming a hedge, his focus unwavering. Scott paused for a moment, watching him work, and felt a pang of emotion. "This is my son, Noah," Scott called, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. Noah turned, smiling faintly. "Mr. Bennett, everything okay?" Scott nodded, though his expression betrayed his unease. "Do you have a moment to talk? It's important." Noah's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Of course, is something wrong?" Scott gestured toward a shaded bench nearby. "Let's sit." The two walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot. Once seated, Scott took a deep breath, searching for the right words to begin. "Noah," he started, his voice softer than usual. "You've been here for a few weeks now, and I've gotten to know you a bit. You're a hardworking, kind, and thoughtful young man. I've come to respect you greatly." Noah looked at him, puzzled by the tone. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." Scott hesitated, his hands clasped tightly together. "There's something I need to tell you, something that might come as a shock." Noah's brow furrowed. "Okay, what is it?" Scott exhaled slowly. 20 years ago, I lost someone very dear to me. My son, Joshua. He was only 5 years old when he disappeared in a car accident. At least, that's what I believed at the time." Noah's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett, that must have been incredibly hard." Scott nodded. "It was. I searched for years, hoping for answers, but none ever came, until now." Noah stiffened slightly, sensing the shift in the conversation. "What do you mean?" Scott met his gaze, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Noah, I believe you are my son, Joshua." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with meaning. For a moment, Noah stared at Scott, his expression frozen in disbelief. Then he let out a nervous laugh. "What? That's impossible." Scott reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it out for Noah to see. "Do you recognize this?" Noah's eyes widened as he stared at the pendant. "I've seen that before," he said slowly. "It was with me at the orphanage. They said it was mine, but I didn't remember it." Scott's voice softened. "It was yours. Your mother gave it to you. She picked it out because it had a small flower engraved on it, just like the ones we used to grow in our garden." Noah's gaze darted between the locket and Scott, his mind racing. "But how? I don't remember any of this." Scott leaned forward, his tone gentle but insistent. "You were so young, Noah. The trauma of what happened likely erased those memories, but the DNA test confirmed it. You're my son." Noah's face paled, and he shook his head, his emotions bubbling to the surface. "No, this doesn't make sense. Why now? Why would you wait all this time to tell me?" Scott's voice cracked as he replied. "I didn't know until recently. When I first saw you, I thought I was imagining things. But the more I looked into your past, the more the pieces fit together. I needed to be sure before I said anything." Noah stood abruptly, pacing a few steps away. "This is insane," he muttered. "I'm just a gardener. I grew up in an orphanage. I don't belong in this life." Scott rose, his voice firm but compassionate. "You're not just a gardener, Noah. You're my son. You belong here, with me." Noah turned to face him, his expression a mixture of anger, confusion, and pain. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up thinking no one wanted you? To feel like you don't have a family, a history, and now you're telling me that I do? That you're my father?" Scott's chest ached at the raw emotion in Noah's voice. "I can't change the past, Noah," he said quietly. "But I can promise you this. I will spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost, if you'll let me." Noah looked away, his jaw tightening as he struggled to process everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Noah spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Barely. I need time to think. Scott nodded, his heart breaking but understanding. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Noah gave a faint nod before walking away, leaving Scott standing alone in the garden. As the young man disappeared from view, Scott felt a mixture of hope and fear. The truth was out, but the path forward was uncertain. All he could do now was wait and hope that Noah, Joshua, would find it in his heart to accept the truth. Noah didn't return to the garden that afternoon. After their conversation, he had retreated to his small room in the staff quarters, shutting the door behind him and sinking onto the edge of the bed. The locket Scott had shown him swam in his mind, its delicate engraving and undeniable familiarity twisting his thoughts into a tangled knot. For years, Noah had lived with the belief that his life began at the orphanage. The staff had always told him he'd been found alone, with no family and no past. He'd accepted it, learned to live with the emptiness. But now, Scott Bennett, his employer, a man he barely knew, was claiming to be his father. It felt surreal, like a story too far-fetched to be real. And yet, there was the locket, and the way Scott looked at him, with a mix of longing and certainty that couldn't be faked. Noah buried his head in his hands. If Scott was telling the truth, it meant everything he thought he knew about himself was a lie. He didn't know how to feel: angry, confused, or hopeful. Scott, meanwhile, spent the evening pacing his study, unable to focus on anything else. His heart ached with the weight of their conversation. Replaying every word and every expression on Noah's face, he knew he had overwhelmed the young man, but there had been no easy way to tell him the truth. All Scott could do now was wait and hope. Marla, his assistant, knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Bennett, you've been in here for hours." Scott stopped pacing and sighed. "Come in," she entered, carrying a tray with a fresh pot of coffee. "Is everything all right? You seem preoccupied?" Scott hesitated before answering. Marla had worked for him for years, and though he trusted her implicitly, he hadn't shared the details of his recent discovery. But now, the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry alone. "I told Noah," Scott said finally, his voice low, Marla's brow furrowed in confusion. "Told him what? That he's my son Joshua." The tray in her hands wobbled slightly as the words sank in. "Oh my goodness, are you certain?" Scott nodded, gesturing toward the desk where the DNA results and the locket lay. "It's him, Marla. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Marla set the tray down carefully, her expression a mixture of shock and concern. "And how did he take it?" Scott let out a bitter laugh. "About as well as you'd expect. He's confused, overwhelmed. I can't blame him, it's a lot to process." Marla took a seat across from him, her usual composed demeanor softening. "Give him time, Scott. This isn't something anyone can accept overnight. He's lived his entire life without knowing who he really is. That kind of revelation, it changes everything." Scott nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know, I've waited 20 years for this. I don't want to lose him again." "You won't," Marla said gently, "but you have to let him come to terms with it in his own way." Noah spent the night tossing and turning, his mind racing with thoughts and emotions he couldn't untangle. Memories that didn't quite feel like his own flitted through his mind. Fleeting images of a warm embrace, the sound of laughter, the scent of freshly baked cookies. Were they real? Or were they just his imagination trying to fill the gaps in his past? By morning, Noah felt no closer to clarity, but he knew one thing. He couldn't avoid Scott forever. He needed answers. Scott was in the garden when Noah finally emerged from the staff quarters. His expression guarded but resolute. He spotted Scott kneeling by a row of hydrangeas, his usually pristine suit jacket replaced with a casual sweater. For a moment, Noah hesitated, unsure of how to start the conversation. Then he squared his shoulders and approached. "Mr. Bennett," Noah called, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Scott looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he stood. "Noah," he said, his tone cautious. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you today." Noah stuffed his hands into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I couldn't stay away. I've been thinking about what you said, and I have questions." Scott nodded, gesturing toward a nearby bench. "Let's talk." They sat in silence for a moment before Noah spoke. "If what you're saying is true, if I'm your son, why did it take you so long to find me?" Scott's chest tightened. He had expected the question, but it didn't make it any easier to answer. After the accident, I did everything I could to find you, he said softly. I hired private investigators, worked with the police, followed every lead, but it was as if you had vanished into thin air. I never stopped searching, but after a while I started to lose hope. Noah frowned, his hands clenching into fists. So what changed? Why now? Scott reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it out to Noah. You changed everything. From the moment I saw you, I felt it. I knew there was something familiar about you. And when I started looking into your past, the pieces started to fit. This locket. It confirmed what my heart already knew. Noah stared at the locket, his emotions flickering across his face. I don't know how to feel about all of this, he admitted. It's like my entire life has been a lie. It hasn't been a lie, Scott said gently. You've lived your life the best way you knew how. But now, you have the chance to reclaim a part of yourself that was taken from you, and I'm here to help you every step of the way. Noah looked up at Scott, his guarded expression softening slightly. I'm not sure if I'm ready for this. Scott's voice was steady as he replied, Take all the time you need. I've waited 20 years to find you, Noah. I can wait a little longer. The days that followed were a delicate dance between Scott and Noah. Both men navigated their newfound relationship cautiously, like two strangers trying to understand a connection they didn't yet fully comprehend. Scott gave Noah the space he needed, resisting the urge to press him for more conversations or answers. Noah, meanwhile, kept himself busy with work in the garden, using the physical labor as a way to process the whirlwind of emotions he was feeling. Scott's resolve to rebuild his bond with his son didn't waver, but he knew that rushing would only push Noah further away. Instead, he focused on finding small, meaningful ways to connect. One afternoon, he called Marla into his study. Marla, Scott began, his tone thoughtful. I need your help with something. She raised an eyebrow, curious. Of course, Mr. Bennett. What do you need? Scott leaned back in his chair. I want to show Noah that he has a place here, that this isn't just about the past. It's about the future, too. Marla nodded slowly. Do you have something specific in mind? I've been thinking, Scott said, about something we used to do when Joshua was little. We'd spend hours building model planes together. It was one of his favorite things. His voice softened at the memory. I want to bring that back, but I don't want to force it. It has to feel natural. Marla smiled. That's a wonderful idea. Maybe start small. Find a way to invite him without making it feel like an obligation. Scott nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. That evening, Scott waited until Noah was finishing up his work in the garden. As the young man was putting away his tools, Scott approached with a small, neatly wrapped package in hand. Noah, Scott called, his voice steady but warm. Noah looked up, wiping his hands on a cloth. Mr. Bennett, he replied, a touch of hesitation in his tone. Everything okay? Scott smiled faintly. I was cleaning out some old boxes in the house and came across this. It reminded me of something I used to do with my son. He handed the package to Noah, who took it cautiously. Inside was a model plane kit, complete with paint and glue. Noah stared at it for a moment, then looked back at Scott. You don't have to do anything with it, Scott added quickly, sensing Noah's uncertainty. But if you're ever interested, I thought we could work on it together. Noah's fingers brushed over the edges of the box, his expression unreadable. Thanks, he said after a moment. I'll think about it. Scott nodded, not pressing further. Take your time. As Scott walked back to the house, he allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. That night, Noah sat on his bed with the model kit resting on his lap. He couldn't explain why, but holding it brought a strange sense of comfort. He remembered seeing kids in the orphanage with toys like this, though he'd never had one himself. The idea of building something with Scott felt foreign, but it also stirred a faint curiosity. The next day, after finishing his work in the garden, Noah hesitated before heading to his room. Instead, he made his way to the main house, the model kit tucked under his arm. He found Scott in the study reading over some documents. Mr. Bennett, Noah began, his voice cutting through the quiet. Scott looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Noah, what can I do for you? Noah held up the kit. I was thinking, Maybe we could give this a try. Scott's expression softened, a smile spreading across his face. Of course, let me grab a few things and we can get started. They moved to a large table in the sunroom, the late afternoon light streaming in through the windows. Scott laid out the tools they would need, small brushes, tweezers, and a magnifying glass, and began unpacking the kit with Noah. Joshua always loved picking out the colors, Scott said, as they examined the tiny parts. He'd mix and match, even if it didn't make sense. Noah chuckled softly. Sounds like he had a good imagination. He did, Scott said, his voice tinged with both pride and sadness. He was curious about everything. As they worked, Noah found himself relaxing. The task was meticulous, requiring focus and steady hands. For a while, they didn't talk much, the quiet filled with the soft clink of tools and the occasional instruction from Scott. You're good at this, Scott observed after a while. You've got an eye for detail. Noah shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I guess working in the garden teaches you patience. Scott nodded. It's a good skill to have. By the time they finished for the day, the framework of the plane was complete. Noah leaned back, looking at their progress with a sense of satisfaction. Not bad, he admitted. Scott smiled. Not bad at all. As they packed up, Scott hesitated, then said, Noah, I want you to know something. I don't expect you to accept all of this right away. I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm here. Whenever you're ready to talk or ask questions. Noah looked at him, his expression thoughtful. Thanks, he said quietly. I appreciate that. Scott nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was progress. For the first time, he felt like the distance between them was beginning to close. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable shift in the dynamic between Scott and Noah. Their shared work on the model plane had created a bridge, a small, fragile connection that neither of them dared to acknowledge outright, but both felt nonetheless. Scott was careful not to push too hard, letting their interactions unfold naturally, while Noah began to lower the walls he had carefully built over the years. One afternoon, Scott found himself back in his study, flipping through an old family photo album. Each page was a time capsule, a glimpse into a life that now felt like a distant dream. Pictures of Joshua at the beach, holding his first kite, and beaming proudly with a birthday cake all seemed to leap off the page. Scott's chest tightened as he realized how many of those memories had been lost to the tragedy. A soft knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. Come in, he called. Noah stepped inside hesitantly, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said. You're not interrupting, Scott replied, closing the album and gesturing for Noah to sit. What's on your mind? Noah shifted uncomfortably before pulling something out of his pocket. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and slightly tattered at the edges. I found this in my room, he said, handing it to Scott. It was with the locket when I left the orphanage. Scott unfolded the paper carefully, his heart pounding. The handwriting was faint but legible. A simple note that read, Joshua, stay strong. We love you. His breath caught in his throat. The words were his wife's, written in the hurried scrawl she had used when she was emotional. Scott traced the letters with his fingers, the memory of her handwriting sending a jolt through him. This, Scott began, his voice unsteady. This was written by your mother. Noah's eyes widened, and he leaned forward. Are you sure? Scott nodded, his voice heavy with emotion. I'd recognize her handwriting anywhere. She must have written this before the accident. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Noah finally broke the silence. What was she like, my mother? Scott smiled faintly, his eyes misting. She was incredible, kind, strong, and fiercely protective. She had a way of making everyone around her feel loved. She adored you. You were her whole world. Noah looked down at his hands, his expression conflicted. It's hard to imagine, he admitted. I don't remember her. I don't remember anything. That's not your fault, Scott said gently. You were so young, and what happened? It was traumatic, but just because you don't remember doesn't mean those moments didn't happen. She loved you more than words can say. Noah nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the floor. Do you ever think about her? All the time, Scott replied. She's a part of you, Noah. Every time I see you, I see her too. Noah looked up, and for the first time, Scott saw a glimmer of something in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even hope. "What about you?" Noah asked. "What were you like as a father?" Scott's chest tightened. The question brought with it a wave of guilt. "I tried to be the best father I could," he said honestly. "But I wasn't perfect. I worked a lot, and I wasn't always around as much as I should have been. But I loved you, Joshua. I still do. I never stopped." The name hung in the air, and Noah flinched slightly at the sound of it. "Joshua," he repeated quietly, as though trying to make sense of it. "It feels strange." Scott leaned forward, his tone earnest. "I don't expect you to accept everything overnight. You've lived as Noah for so long. That's who you are now. But Joshua is still a part of you. And when you're ready, we can figure out how to bring those pieces together." Noah nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I guess it's just a lot to take in." "I understand," Scott said, "and I'm here no matter what." Later that evening, Noah wandered through the garden, the folded note still in his hand. The words echoed in his mind. "Stay strong. We love you." He tried to imagine what his life might have been like if the accident hadn't happened, if he'd grown up with Scott and his mother instead of the orphanage. The thought felt distant and unreal, like a story that belonged to someone else. As he walked, he found himself stopping near the greenhouse. The memory of building the model plane with Scott came to mind, and for the first time, he realized how much he had enjoyed it. There had been a sense of ease, of belonging, that he hadn't felt in years. Noah sat on a nearby bench, staring up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. He thought about everything Scott had told him, about his mother, about their life before the accident, about the love that had been taken from them. And for the first time, Noah allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could find a place in that life again. Scott watched from the window of his study as Noah sat in the garden, the note clutched in his hand. His heart ached with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but seeing Noah there, contemplating the pieces of his past, gave him the strength to keep trying. For the first time in 20 years, Scott felt like the emptiness in his heart might finally begin to heal. The morning after their heartfelt conversation, Noah woke early, his mind restless and clouded. He couldn't shake the image of the note his mother had written, nor the way Scott's voice had trembled with emotion when he talked about the life they had lost. It was all too much, too fast, and though a part of him wanted to believe it, another part remained wary. He wasn't sure he was ready to let his guard down completely as the sun rose over the Bennett estate. Noah decided to busy himself in the garden, hoping the familiar rhythm of work would quiet his thoughts. But just as he was settling into his routine, Marla approached him, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a hint of hesitation. "Noah," she began, her voice kind but firm, "Mr. Bennett has asked to see you in his study. He said it's important." Noah's stomach tightened. Scott's study had always felt like forbidden territory, an imposing room filled with books, dark wood, and the weight of unspoken authority. Still, he nodded and followed Marla back to the house, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead when he entered the study. Scott was seated behind his desk, a manila folder resting in front of him. He looked up as Noah stepped inside, offering a small, cautious smile. "Noah, thanks for coming, please. Have a seat." Noah sat stiffly in the chair opposite Scott, his posture rigid with apprehension. "What's this about?" he asked. Scott slid the folder across the desk, his expression unreadable. "There's something I need to show you. It's about the night you disappeared." Noah hesitated before reaching for the folder. When he opened it, his eyes were met with a collection of documents, photos, and reports. Among them was a copy of the police report from the night of the accident, detailing the chaotic scene where a car had veered off the road and plunged into a ravine. There was also a grainy photo of a mangled vehicle, its frame barely recognizable. But what caught Noah's attention most was a set of handwritten notes and a timeline. As he skimmed the pages, one detail stood out. One, sending a chill down his spine. "Wait," Noah said, his voice trembling. "This says the accident wasn't an accident." Scott nodded grimly. "That's what I've come to believe. At the time, the police ruled it as an accident, but there were inconsistencies, details that didn't add up. I've spent years looking into it, and I'm convinced it was deliberate. Noah's hands tightened around the folder. Deliberate? You're saying someone tried to kill us? Scott's jaw clenched. His eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. I believe someone orchestrated the crash to take you. It wasn't about me or your mother. It was about you. The room fell into a tense silence as Noah struggled to process the revelation. Why would anyone want to take me? I was just a kid. I don't know, Scott admitted. But I suspect it had to do with money or leverage. Whoever was behind it must have seen you as a way to hurt me. Noah's mind raced, the weight of the information pressing down on him. And you think this person just gave up and left me at an orphanage? Scott nodded slowly. It's possible the plan didn't go as expected. Maybe something went wrong, and they panicked. I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm determined to find out. Noah's eyes narrowed. You've been looking into this for years, and you're only telling me now. Scott's expression softened. I didn't want to overwhelm you. I wanted to be sure before bringing you into this. Noah stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. So, what? You've been playing detective this whole time, keeping me in the dark. It wasn't like that, Scott said, his voice calm but firm. I was trying to protect you. Protect me, Noah repeated, his voice rising. You've been digging into my life without telling me, treating me like some kind of mystery to solve. How is that supposed to make me feel? Scott stood as well, his tone steady. Noah, I didn't mean to hurt you. I've spent 20 years trying to find you, to bring you back. Everything I've done has been for you. Noah's jaw tightened, his emotions swirling in a storm of anger, confusion, and betrayal. You should have told me from the beginning. Instead, you've been keeping secrets just like everyone else. Noah, Scott began, his voice pleading, but the young man held up a hand to stop him. I need some air, Noah said sharply. Turning and walking out of the study without another word, Noah stormed out into the garden, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of everything. He felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, leaving him unsteady and unsure of where to stand. The revelation about the crash, about Scott's investigation, only deepened the chasm of uncertainty he'd been grappling with as he paced the garden paths. Memories from his childhood at the orphanage surfaced, moments of feeling lost, unwanted, and forgotten. He'd spent years building a life for himself, accepting that he had no past to hold on to. Now, all of that was being unraveled, and he didn't know how to cope. Scott watched from the window of his study as Noah walked away, his shoulders tense with emotion. He felt a pang of regret, knowing he had pushed too far too fast, but he also knew that the truth couldn't be hidden forever. Noah deserved to know what had happened. Even if it hurt in the moment, Scott sat back down at his desk, staring at the folder that had ignited the confrontation. He made a silent vow to uncover the truth behind the crash, no matter how painful it might be. For Noah's sake, and for his own, he couldn't let the past remain in the shadows any longer. Noah spent the rest of the day wandering the sprawling grounds of the Bennett estate, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The revelation that the accident wasn't an accident had unsettled him deeply. The very foundation of his identity, already fragile, was now riddled with more questions than answers. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Noah found himself near the old greenhouse. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of roses and freshly cut grass. He sat on the stone bench nearby, his head in his hands, as fragments of Scott's words echoed in his mind. It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to take you. But why? The question gnawed at him. He wasn't anyone special. He had no wealth, no influence. At least, not the kind that would make someone target him. The idea that his disappearance had been part of a plan, only for him to end up abandoned, felt both absurd and terrifying inside the mansion. Scott sat in his study nursing a glass of scotch. The confrontation with Noah had left him shaken, but he refused to regret telling the truth. Noah deserved to know, even if it hurt. Yet Scott couldn't ignore the pain in his son's eyes as he stormed out. He had spent 2 decades longing for this reunion. But now, every step forward seemed to push them 2 steps back. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Marla entered, her expression a mix of concern and resolve. "Mr. Bennett," she began. I couldn't help but notice Noah looked Upset when he left the house, Scott sighed, setting his glass down. He found out about the investigation, about the accident not being an accident. Marla's brow furrowed. I see. And how did he take it? As expected, Scott admitted. He feels betrayed. I don't blame him, but I had no choice. He needed to know. Marla stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. If I may, sir, perhaps he needs more than just the truth. He needs to know you're with him, not just investigating his past. Show him he's not alone in this. Scott nodded slowly. You're right. I just don't know how to reach him. Give him time, Marla said gently, but don't let him drift too far. He's still trying to figure out where he belongs. Noah returned to the staff quarters late that evening. Exhausted from hours of aimless wandering, he dropped onto his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The faint hum of the estate's central air system was the only sound in the quiet room. After a while, he reached for the locket on the nightstand. Holding it in his hand, he traced the delicate engraving with his thumb, wondering if it really could be the key to understanding who he was. He turned it over, noticing for the first time a small latch on the side. Curious, he gently pried it open. Inside was a tiny photograph, worn and faded with time. It showed a man and a woman smiling warmly, holding a young boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The boy's face was round and full of joy, and the woman had the same kind eyes Noah saw in the mirror every day. His breath caught in his throat. It was them, his parents, the proof he hadn't known he was looking for. The next morning, Noah approached Scott in the dining room, holding the open locket in his hand. Scott looked up from his coffee, surprised to see Noah standing there with an intensity in his eyes he hadn't seen before. Noah, Scott said cautiously, is everything all right? Noah placed the locket on the table in front of Scott. Did you know this was in here? He asked, his voice steady but charged with emotion. Scott picked up the locket, his brow furrowing as he examined the tiny photograph inside. A wave of nostalgia and pain washed over him as he recognized the image. Your mother put this in the locket, he said softly. She wanted you to always have us with you. Noah sat down across from him, his gaze unwavering. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why did I have to figure this out on my own? Scott set the locket down carefully. No one knew, Noah, when I lost you. I lost everything. The locket was gone. The trail was cold. I didn't even know if you were alive. And when I found you, I didn't want to overwhelm you with too much at once. Noah's expression softened, though the confusion remained. I've spent my whole life wondering who I was, and now you're telling me I had a family who cared about me all along. It's hard to accept. I know, Scott said, his voice thick with emotion. But you've always had a family, even when we were apart. I never stopped searching for you. Never stopped loving you. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint chirping of birds outside. Noah leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. So what now? He asked quietly. Scott met his gaze, his eyes filled with determination. Now we figure this out together. We find the truth about what happened that night, and we make sure whoever took you pays for what they did. Noah hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay, but I need time to process all of this. I can't just flip a switch and accept it all. Take all the time you need, Scott said, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in days, Noah felt a glimmer of hope, not just for answers, but for the possibility of rebuilding a connection he'd thought was lost forever. Over the next few days, Noah and Scott settled into a tentative rhythm. Their conversations, once strained and stilted, grew more frequent and open. It was clear that both were trying, Scott to rebuild the connection he had lost, and Noah to make sense of a world that now seemed to carry more questions than answers. Noah, however, remained cautious. He wasn't ready to call Scott Dad, or fully embrace the idea of being Joshua Bennett. He still felt like an outsider, unsure of his place in this unfamiliar reality. But as he spent more time with Scott, he began to see glimpses of the man he might have known as a father. A man who, despite his wealth and influence, carried the weight of grief and regret with quiet resilience. One morning, Scott called Noah into his study. The room was its usual blend of dark woods and polished surfaces. But today, the desk was cluttered with papers, maps, and photographs. Scott gestured for Noah to sit. I've been going through the investigation files again, Scott began, his tone serious. I think there's more to uncover about the night you disappeared. Noah hesitated, glancing at the array of documents. I thought you'd already looked into everything. I thought so too, Scott admitted. But there were details I overlooked, things that didn't seem important at the time. With your help, I think we can piece together what really happened. Noah leaned forward, curious despite himself. What kind of details? Scott picked up a photograph and handed it to Noah. It was a grainy image of the crash site, the mangled car barely visible among the twisted trees and debris. This was taken by the first responders, Scott explained. At the time, they reported no signs of foul play. But look here. He pointed to a section of the photo where the guardrail had been torn away. This damage doesn't match the trajectory of the crash. It's almost as if the car was forced off the road. Noah studied the photo, his brow furrowing. You think someone hit you? Scott nodded. It's possible. But whoever did it was careful. They didn't leave behind any obvious evidence. Noah set the photo down, a cold knot forming in his stomach. So, what now? How do we find out who was behind it? Scott opened a folder and pulled out a handwritten list. I've been tracking down people who might have information. Witnesses. Former investigators. Even the tow truck driver who handled the wreckage. Some of them are still around, and I think it's worth talking to them. Noah nodded slowly. Okay, where do we start? Their first lead was a retired highway patrol officer named Gary Whitmore. Scott had arranged to meet him at a small diner just outside Los Angeles, and Noah agreed to join him, though his nerves were evident. The drive to the diner was quiet, the tension in the car palpable. Scott glanced at Noah as they approached their destination. Are you okay? Noah shrugged, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. I don't know, this just feels surreal. Scott reached over and gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. We'll take it one step at a time. When they arrived, Gary was already waiting in a corner booth, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with weathered features and a sharp gaze that hadn't dulled with age. He stood as Scott and Noah approached, extending a hand. Mr. Bennett, he greeted, his voice gravelly. And you must be Noah. Noah shook his hand, feeling the weight of the man's scrutiny. Nice to meet you. They sat, and after a few pleasantries, Scott got straight to the point. Gary, I appreciate you meeting us. I'm hoping you can shed some light on the night of the crash. Gary nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. I remember it well. It's not the kind of thing you forget. Scott pulled out a copy of the crash report and placed it on the table. You mentioned in your initial statement that you arrived at the scene shortly after the accident. Did you notice anything unusual? Gary leaned back, his expression thoughtful. At the time, no, it looked like a straightforward accident, but I'll admit, something about it always bothered me. What do you mean? Noah asked, his voice quiet but steady. Gary's gaze shifted to him. The guardrail. It was bent in a way that didn't make sense, like something heavy had hit it before the car went off the road. I mentioned it to my superiors, but they dismissed it, said it was probably a coincidence. Scott frowned. Did you see anything else? Another vehicle, perhaps? Gary shook his head. No, but there were tire marks leading away from the scene. They weren't from your car. I brought it up in my report, but no one followed up on it. Noah exchanged a glance with Scott, the pieces beginning to click into place. So, someone else was there? Noah said. It seems likely, Gary agreed. But whoever it was, they were gone by the time I arrived. Scott's jaw tightened. Do you think someone tampered with the investigation? Gary hesitated before nodding. It's possible. Accidents like this, they don't always get the attention they deserve, especially if someone wants to keep things quiet. Scott sat back, the weight of Gary's words settling over him. Thank you, he said finally. This gives us a starting point. As they left the diner, Noah felt a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and a burning desire for answers. He turned to Scott as they got into the car. What do we do now? Scott's expression was resolute. We keep digging. Whoever did this tried to cover their tracks, but we're going to uncover the truth, no matter what it takes. Noah nodded, a spark of determination igniting in his chest. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just searching for answers, he was fighting for justice. The drive back to the Bennett estate was unusually quiet. Noah sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing with thoughts of the conversation at the diner. Gary Whitmore's words echoed in his head, each revelation adding another layer to the mystery of his past. The idea that someone had intentionally caused the accident and then worked to cover it up left him feeling both angry and vulnerable. Scott, sensing Noah's turmoil, glanced over at him. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Noah shook his head, his hands tightening into fists. "Not really. I mean, how do we even begin to unravel this? If someone was willing to cover up their tracks back then, they probably don't want us digging now." Scott's jaw tightened, his own frustration barely concealed. "You're right, but that doesn't mean we stop. If anything, it means we push harder. Whoever did this has gotten away with it for too long." Noah nodded, though the weight of it all still hung heavy on him. "It just feels like there's no end to this." Scott's voice softened. "There will be, I promise. We'll figure this out together." Back at the estate, Scott headed to his study, where he began reviewing the notes and files spread across his desk. Noah, still restless, joined him, pacing the room as Scott worked. The sound of the clock ticking in the background added to the tension in the air. After a few moments, Scott looked up. "I've been thinking about what Gary said. The tire marks and the bent guardrail. If another car was involved, it had to belong to someone who knew what they were doing. This wasn't random. Someone who wanted me gone," Noah added bitterly. Scott nodded. "Exactly. And whoever it was had the resources to make the investigation go away. That means we're looking at someone with influence. Someone who had something to gain." Noah stopped pacing, turning to face Scott. "But why? Why go through all of this just to take me? I was just a kid." Scott hesitated, his gaze heavy with regret. "Because of me," he said finally. "Because of who I am." Noah frowned. "What do you mean?" "My business, my wealth. It's always made me a target," Scott explained. "I've dealt with threats, lawsuits, even blackmail over the years. But back then, I didn't think anyone would stoop low enough to target my family." "I was wrong," Noah's anger flared. "So someone tried to hurt you by taking me. That's sick." "It is," Scott agreed. "But now we have to figure out who would have had the motive and the means to pull something like this off." Noah sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So, where do we start?" Scott flipped through the files, pulling out a list of names. "I've already started narrowing it down. These are people who had a reason to go after me back then. Business rivals, disgruntled employees, even a few family members." Noah raised an eyebrow. "Family members?" Scott hesitated, then nodded. "My brother Jeffrey, he and I had a complicated relationship. He always resented me for taking over the family business. We had our fair share of arguments, and there were times I thought he might try to undermine me, but I never imagined he'd go this far." Noah stared at him, disbelief and anger mixing in his expression. "You think your own brother did this?" "I don't know," Scott admitted, "but it's a possibility we can't ignore." Noah exhaled sharply, sitting down across from Scott. "So what do we do? Just show up at his house and accuse him?" Scott shook his head. "No, we need proof. If Jeffrey was involved, he'll have left a trail, even if it's a small one. We start with his financial records. His movements around the time of the accident, anything that might link him to what happened. And if we find something," Noah asked, "then we confront him," Scott said firmly, "and we make sure he's held accountable." The next day, Scott made a few discreet calls to old contacts, including a private investigator who specialized in tracing financial irregularities. Meanwhile, Noah spent the morning going through files in the study, trying to familiarize himself with the people Scott suspected. It didn't take long for a lead to emerge. The investigator called back with a crucial piece of information. Jeffrey had made a large, unaccounted-for withdrawal from his bank account just days before the accident. The amount was suspiciously close to the ransom demands typically seen in high-profile kidnappings. Scott's face darkened as he relayed the news to Noah. "It's not definitive, but it's enough to warrant a conversation." Noah felt a surge of adrenaline. "Then let's go talk to him." Scott hesitated. "Are you sure this won't be easy? Jeffrey isn't the kind of person to admit anything without a fight." "I don't care," Noah said, his voice firm. "I want answers." They arrived at Jeffrey's estate later that afternoon. The house was smaller than Scott's, but no less impressive, its grand facade giving the impression of wealth and power. A butler greeted them at the door, his expression carefully neutral as he led them to Jeffrey's office. Jeffrey Bennett was seated behind a large oak desk, his sharp features and calculating eyes, a mirror of Scott's. But with a colder edge, he stood as they entered, his smile tight and insincere. "Scott," he said, his tone dripping with faux warmth, "to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Scott didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk, Jeffrey. It's about the night of the accident." Jeffrey's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "What about it?" Scott stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I know you made a large withdrawal from your account just days before it happened. Care to explain?" Jeffrey's jaw tightened, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't see how my finances are any of your business. They are when they're tied to the disappearance of my son," Scott shot back. "What did you do, Jeffrey?" Noah watched the exchange, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time, he saw the truth in Jeffrey's eyes, a flicker of guilt, quickly masked by indignation. "I don't have to answer to you," Jeffrey said, his voice rising. "You're barking up the wrong tree." Scott leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "If you had anything to do with this, I will find out. And when I do, you'll regret ever thinking you could get away with it." Jeffrey said nothing, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. As Scott and Noah turned to leave, the tension in the room was palpable. Outside, Noah turned to Scott. "He knows something," he said. Scott nodded grimly. "And we're going to prove it." Scott and Noah left Jeffrey's estate with a renewed sense of determination. But the confrontation left both men shaken. The brief flicker of guilt in Jeffrey's eyes was enough to confirm that he was hiding something. But they needed more than suspicion. They needed undeniable proof. That evening, back at the Bennett estate, Scott pored over the investigator's report in his study, while Noah paced the room. The atmosphere was tense, the silence broken only by the sound of paper shuffling and the occasional frustrated sigh. "This isn't enough," Scott muttered, setting the report down. "We need something concrete, something he can't deny." Noah stopped pacing and turned to face him. "What about the money? Can we track where it went?" Scott nodded thoughtfully. "The investigator is working on that now. If Jeffrey paid someone to stage the crash or take you, there might be a record, but it's not just about the money. We need to find whoever was involved and get them to talk." Noah crossed his arms, his frustration evident. "And what if they won't? What if this whole thing ends up buried again?" Scott's gaze hardened. "I won't let that happen. Not this time." The next morning, Scott received a call from the investigator. "Mr. Bennett," the man began, his tone brisk. "I've traced the withdrawal. It was funneled through a series of accounts to a man named Vincent Cole. He's got a criminal record, mostly small-time offenses, but there's one charge for conspiracy tied to a suspected kidnapping years ago." Scott's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you know where we can find him?" "Yes," the investigator replied. "He's been staying at a motel on the outskirts of town. I can send you the address." "Do it," Scott said, his voice firm. "And thank you." When Scott shared the information with Noah, the young man's expression darkened. "So this guy took the money? What do we do now?" Scott stood, his resolve evident. "We pay him a visit." The motel was as run down as they expected, its neon sign flickering intermittently. Scott and Noah parked a short distance away, their nerves taut as they approached the room number the investigator had provided. Scott knocked on the door, his movements calm but deliberate. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a wiry man in his late 40s with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He looked them up and down, suspicion etched across his face. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice rough. Scott didn't hesitate. "We need to talk. It's about Jeffrey Bennett." Vincent's eyes narrowed, and he started to close the door, but Noah stepped forward, blocking it with his foot. "We're not here to cause trouble," Noah said, his tone firm. "We just want answers." Vincent hesitated, his gaze flicking between the two men before finally stepping aside. "Fine. Make it quick." Inside, the room was cluttered and smelled faintly of cigarettes. Vincent gestured for them to sit, but Scott remained standing, his eyes locked on the man who might hold the key to everything. "We know Jeffrey paid you," Scott began, his voice cold. 20 years ago, a large sum of money. We want to know why." Vincent's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." Scott leaned closer, his tone sharp. "Don't lie to me. We've traced the money. You took it. And now you're going to tell us what you did." Vincent smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Even if I did know something, what makes you think I'd tell you?" Scott's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure the authorities know exactly where to find you. And I'm guessing you wouldn't want them digging into your past." Vincent's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "You think you can scare me?" Noah stepped forward, his voice steady but intense. "We're not here to scare you. We're here for the truth. What happened to me that night?" Vincent froze, his eyes narrowing as he studied Noah more closely. "You," he muttered, realization dawning. "You're the kid." Noah's jaw tightened. "Yeah, and I deserve to know what happened." Vincent hesitated, his tough exterior cracking under the weight of Noah's words. He let out a long sigh and rubbed his temples. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "I'll tell you what I know." Scott and Noah exchanged a tense glance as Vincent began to speak. "Jeffrey hired me and a couple of other guys," Vincent admitted. "Said he wanted us to stage a crash, make it look like an accident. The plan was to grab the kid, you, and hold you for ransom. But something went wrong." "What went wrong?" Scott demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. "The crash didn't go as planned," Vincent said. "Your wife, she fought back. Things got messy and we panicked. By the time we got to the car, she was gone. And so were you. We didn't know if you were dead or alive." Noah's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white. "And you just left me there." Vincent nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. "We didn't know what else to do. We figured the cops would find you eventually, and we'd be in the clear." Scott's voice was cold as ice. "Do you have any idea what you did to our family?" Vincent looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't sign up for things to go that far." "But Jeffrey, he didn't care. He just wanted the money." Scott's hands shook with rage, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're going to testify," he said. "You're going to tell the authorities everything." Vincent hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Fine, but if I do this, you'll make sure I don't go down alone. Jeffrey needs to pay for what he did." Scott's expression hardened. "Don't worry, he will." As they left the motel, Noah felt a mix of anger, relief, and exhaustion. The truth was finally coming to light, but it had come at a heavy cost. Scott placed a hand on his shoulder as they walked to the car. "We're almost there," he said quietly. "We'll make this right." Noah nodded, his gaze steady. "Let's finish this." The drive back to the Bennett estate was filled with a heavy silence. The air between Scott and Noah was thick with unspoken emotions, anger, frustration, and a grim determination to see things through. The confession from Vincent had confirmed their worst fears. Jeffrey had orchestrated the crash that tore their family apart. Now, they had the truth, but justice still needed to be served. Noah stared out the window, his mind replaying Vincent's words over and over. The idea that his uncle, someone who should have been part of his family, was responsible for so much pain made his stomach churn. "Do you think he'll try to deny it?" Noah asked, breaking the silence. Scott tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "He'll deny it, fight it, and do everything he can to save himself. But we have Vincent's confession, the financial records, and the evidence tying him to the crash. He won't get away with this." Noah nodded, though the knot in his chest didn't loosen. "And if he does, if he finds some way to twist things..." Scott glanced at him, his expression resolute. "Then we'll fight harder. I've spent 20 years living with this pain, Noah. I'm not letting him take anything more from us." Back at the estate, Scott made arrangements to meet with his legal team. He wanted every piece of evidence meticulously prepared before they confronted Jeffrey again. Meanwhile, Noah found himself gravitating to the garden, the one place where he felt even a semblance of calm. As he pruned the rose bushes, his thoughts wandered to the life he might have had if the crash had never happened. He imagined birthday parties with his parents, family vacations, and simple moments of love and stability. But those images were fleeting, overshadowed by the reality of growing up in an orphanage, believing he had no family. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. Turning, he saw Scott approaching. A solemn look on his face, "I wanted to check on you," Scott said, his voice gentle. "You've been through a lot these past few days." Noah shrugged, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm fine, just trying to process it all." Scott nodded, his eyes scanning the vibrant flowers. "I know it's not easy, but I want you to know how proud I am of you, for your strength, your courage. None of this has been fair to you, but you've handled it better than I could have imagined." Noah looked at him, his expression softening. "I guess I didn't have much of a choice." "Even so," Scott said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared pain and determination hanging between them. Finally, Scott spoke again. "I've scheduled a meeting with the authorities. Vincent is ready to give a statement, and once he does, we'll have enough to bring Jeffrey in." Noah nodded, his jaw tightening. Good. It's time he faced the consequences. The meeting with the authorities was tense but productive. Vincent's statement, combined with the financial records and other evidence, painted a damning picture of Jeffrey's involvement. The police assured Scott and Noah that they had enough to move forward with an arrest. 2 days later, Scott received the call they had been waiting for. Jeffrey had been taken into custody. The news brought a sense of relief, but also a bittersweet acknowledgement of the damage that had already been done. Noah watched the coverage on the news later that evening, the images of his uncle being led into a police car replaying on the screen. "I thought I'd feel better," he admitted, his voice subdued. Scott sat beside him, his expression contemplative. "Justice doesn't erase the pain. It just ensures that the person responsible doesn't hurt anyone else." Noah nodded, though the heaviness in his chest remained. "Do you think he'll admit to everything?" Scott sighed. "I don't know, but with the evidence we have, it won't matter. The truth is out now." The trial that followed was grueling, dredging up memories and emotions that both Scott and Noah had tried to suppress. Jeffrey maintained his innocence at first, but as the evidence mounted, his demeanor shifted. In the end, faced with overwhelming proof, he entered a plea deal, admitting to his role in the crash and the attempted ransom. When the verdict was finally delivered, sentencing Jeffrey to decades in prison, Scott and Noah sat together in the courtroom, their hands clasped tightly. The weight of the past 2 decades seemed to lift, if only slightly. Life at the Bennett estate slowly began to find a new rhythm in the weeks that followed. The garden, once a place of solace for Noah, became a symbol of growth and renewal. He spent hours there, not just working but reflecting on the journey he and Scott had taken together one afternoon. As they sat on the stone bench under the oak tree, Scott handed Noah a photo album. "I thought you might want this," he said. "It's full of memories, of your mother, of us. I want you to have it." Noah opened the album, his eyes scanning the pictures. Each one told a story. A trip to the beach, a birthday celebration, a quiet moment at home. For the first time, he felt a connection to the life he had lost, and a flicker of hope for the life he could rebuild. "Thanks," Noah said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Scott smiled, his own eyes glistening. "You're my son, Noah. That's all that matters." For the first time, Noah didn't hesitate. "I know, Dad." The word felt foreign but right, and as it hung in the air, both men felt the weight of their shared pain begin to ease. They had faced the truth, sought justice, and found each other again. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they knew they had the strength to move forward, together.